November 16, 2022. A Wisconsin courtroom sat frozen in a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself refused to move. Every seat was filled, yet no one dared to breathe as Darrell Brooks stood mere feet from the judge who would decide the rest of his existence. He wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't trembling. He looked strangely still, almost detached, as if he couldn't fully comprehend that his life was about to collapse in real time. Judge Jennifer Dorough studied him with an expression that held no anger, only the weight of what justice required. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't just echo through the room. It struck like a hammer. 6 life sentences. No parole. And then, as though time itself needed reinforcing, she layered on an additional 762 years. The number drifted across the courtroom like something unreal, something impossible, a figure no human being could ever absorb. Some in the audience quietly gasped. Others stared straight ahead, jaws tight, remembering the faces of loved ones lost in the Waukesha parade. Brooks blinked, but no visible emotion cracked through. He just stood there, a man hearing the mathematical end of his humanity. Most people think a sentence like that is symbolic. They imagine it's just paperwork, words on a page. What they don't understand is that this moment wasn't symbolic at all. It was the first step into a fate many argue is far beyond what death could ever deliver. Death ends a life. This sentence stretched it until every remaining second would take something from him. Sanity, comfort, the illusion of hope, piece by piece. When the judge finished, the courtroom didn't erupt. There was no dramatic outburst, no shouting, no final confrontation. Instead, the silence deepened. A strange, cold acceptance washed over the space as deputies stepped closer to Brooks. Families watched him with eyes full of pain. Some cried quietly. Others stared at the floor, unwilling to look at the man who had taken so much from them. And then Brooks was escorted out. No fight, no moment of reflection, just a quiet exit into a future he would never escape. The door closed behind him with a dull, heavy thud. That sound, simple, unremarkable, marked the true beginning of what came next. It was the moment Darrell Brooks stopped being a defendant and became an inmate. Not an inmate with a timeline, not an inmate with a parole date or a distant possibility of second chances. An inmate destined to disappear into a system designed to swallow men whole. He didn't know it yet, but the life waiting for him past those doors wasn't just harsh. It was a slow, relentless descent into something far worse than death could ever promise. The ride to Dodge Correctional Institution wasn't long, but for someone like Darrell Brooks, it might as well have been a journey off the edge of the world. The van's metal cage rattled with every bump, and through the tiny, wire-covered window, the sky outside faded into a dull, colorless gray. Dodge wasn't just a prison. It was a final destination, the place where Wisconsin sends the men it considers too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too hated to blend into the rest. When the gates slid open, it wasn't welcoming him. It was consuming him. Inside those towering concrete walls, news travels fast. Inmates had watched his trial on prison televisions. They knew every detail. How he plowed through a Christmas parade, how he mocked the court, how he argued with a judge as though the deaths of children and grandparents were nothing more than an inconvenience. By the time Brooks set foot through the intake doors, his name had already become a curse. You don't enter a place like Dodge unnoticed. Not when you've done what he's done. Prison operates on its own laws, silent ones, unwritten, but enforced with brutal precision. And the very first rule is clear. Anyone who harms children or families, especially during a celebration, becomes prey. No second chances, no explanations. Brooks didn't walk into Dodge as an inmate. He walked in as a target, the kind no one protects unless they're forced to. During processing, officers took his clothes, his fingerprints, his mugshot. They cataloged him like an object, another piece of the system's inventory. But even then, a subtle tension filled the room. Guards didn't look at him like they looked at anyone else. Their eyes carried something heavier, anger, disgust, maybe even a little disbelief that someone could do what he did. They didn't have to speak to make that clear. Their silence said enough. By the time he was escorted to his cell, Dodge's hierarchy had already placed him at the absolute bottom. And that cell, 6 feet by 9, barely enough space to stretch out, wasn't just a room. It was his new universe. Cold concrete walls, a thin mattress on a metal slab, a stainless steel toilet offering no privacy at all. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, flickering just enough to irritate the mind. When the door slammed shut behind him, it echoed down the hallway like the ceiling of a tomb. From that moment forward, he was alone, truly alone. 23 hours a day in a box smaller than the average bathroom. A box that would become his world for years to come. No roommates, no conversations, no chance of blending in. His so-called recreation was just stepping into another fenced cage, pacing alone while distant voices and footsteps reminded him of everything he'd never be part of again. This wasn't solitary confinement as a temporary punishment. This was his protection, his cage, his sentence, his reality. And the system knew what isolation like this does to a person. It breaks the mind slowly, the way water carves canyons. Quietly, patiently, relentlessly. In that small concrete box, silence can become a weapon sharper than any knife. And for Darrell Brooks, it had only just begun to cut. The officers didn't waste a second. Once they had her separated from everyone else in the unit, they brought her into a narrow interview room. Plain walls, flickering light, and a table that felt colder than the air around it. She sat there with her wrists cuffed, staring at the metal surface like she could burn a hole straight through it. But what stood out most was the look on her face. Not fear, not confusion, but a kind of simmering frustration, as if the world had inconvenienced her yet again. That was her pattern. The rules weren't just rules, they were challenges. And whenever she felt cornered, she didn't shrink back. She pushed harder. When investigators asked her to explain what happened, she tossed out the same rehearsed lines she always used. She painted herself as the misunderstood one, the target, the victim of endless provocation. And yet, every detail she gave contradicted what the officers had already documented on camera. Her story bent and twisted depending on the angle, but the truth remained steady, and it wasn't on her side. The more she talked, the more she trapped herself in her own words. It was almost as if she'd lived in that mindset for so long that she no longer recognized the difference between reality and the version she repeated to herself. But the investigation didn't stop there. Officers dug deeper, turning their attention to the hallway where the fight began. They reviewed footage again, slowing it down frame by frame. Every shoulder twitch, every step, every motion told a story. And the story matched exactly what the staff had witnessed. She had been the one to move first, the one to escalate, the one who made a calculated choice and then tried to reshape the narrative afterward. That was what made the whole situation even more unsettling. Not the violence itself, prisons see that every day, but the level of intent behind her actions. Back in the unit, word traveled fast. Other inmates talked in hushed tones, glancing at the empty bunk where she had slept. They weren't surprised she'd been removed. Almost everyone expected something like this sooner or later. What shocked them was how close it came to turning into something far worse. Some said she'd reached a breaking point. Others believed she had been spiraling for much longer. And this was simply the moment when all the pressure finally erupted. Meanwhile, the officers prepared the next steps, knowing exactly where this was headed. Segregation was guaranteed. Additional charges were possible. And for her, another chapter of consequences had just begun. They moved her into segregation just after midnight. The kind of transfer that isn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet walk down a long corridor where every footstep echoes like a warning. The door opened, and the isolation cell waited for her. A concrete slab, a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and 4 walls designed to make a person confront themselves. Most inmates broke down the first night, pacing, panicking, or shouting for attention. But she didn't. She stepped inside, turned once to glare at the officers, and sat down like she was settling into a place she already knew far too well. Seg wasn't new to her. If anything, it felt like returning to an old, unwelcome routine. But this time, something was different. She wasn't being punished for disrespect, or possession of contraband, or breaking minor rules. This was violence, serious, recorded, undeniable. And the administration wasn't looking at it as just another incident. They were treating it as a window into her worsening mindset. Even the warden reviewed the footage personally, watching it multiple times. The question wasn't simply what happened. It was why she did it now, after months of tension, warnings, and close calls. Inside the cell, she kept her posture rigid, staring at the door like she expected it to swing open again. But nobody came. Hours passed. The air felt heavier, the silence louder, and slowly her frustration shifted into something colder. Calculation. She started replaying everything in her mind. The confrontation, the voices, the moment she stepped forward. She didn't see regret in any of it. Instead, she replayed ways she could have justified it better. That was what stood out about her more than anything else. Consequences never taught her lessons. They just gave her new angles to exploit. The officers outside her door discussed her future in low voices. Some believed she'd pushed it too far this time. Others thought the isolation might finally crack that hardened exterior. But one thing they agreed on, letting her return to general population anytime soon, was a risk nobody wanted to take. Not for the other inmates, not for the staff, and not even for her. Because every time she came out of segregation, her behavior escalated just a little more, as if each punishment only fed the fire inside her. By morning, the report was already on the warden's desk. Multiple witnesses, clear video, a pattern of escalating aggression, and a growing concern that she wasn't done yet. Seg was only the beginning, and everyone knew the real battle would start the moment she tried to justify her actions to the disciplinary board. When the disciplinary board convened later that week, the atmosphere felt noticeably heavier. Everyone in that room already knew her history. Every violation, every moment where she'd pushed the boundaries just far enough to stay out of major trouble, and every time she'd looked officials straight in the eye as if daring them to try controlling her. But this time, she wasn't walking into the hearing as a rule breaker. She was walking in as a growing threat. The officers escorted her in with a firmness that didn't exist before, like even they weren't sure what she might do if the room got too tense. She sat down slowly, cuffs still on, back straight, expression unreadable. For a brief moment, the room was silent. Then the board members began reading the incident report, each detail hitting the air like a cold nail being hammered into place. She didn't blink. She didn't shift. She didn't show the slightest sign of remorse. Instead, she watched them with that same hardened intensity, like someone analyzing her opponents rather than acknowledging authority. When they asked for her statement, she leaned forward and gave the same rehearsed narrative she'd clung to from the moment she was detained. According to her, she was provoked, threatened, cornered, whatever version she needed to protect her pride. But her voice lacked conviction. Maybe she realized the footage contradicted everything she said. Maybe she simply didn't care. Either way, the board saw through it. Her words were hollow, stripped of sincerity. And underlying every sentence was her true reaction: defiance. The board didn't respond to her excuses. They didn't argue or challenge her. They had the evidence. They had witnesses. They knew her history. Her fate was already sealed before she even walked into the room. The only question was how far the punishment would go this time. Extended segregation was guaranteed. Loss of privileges was guaranteed. But behind closed doors, the higher-ups were discussing something far more serious: whether she needed long-term placement in a more controlled environment. Somewhere she couldn't manipulate, provoke, or intimidate her way into chaos. When officers escorted her back to her isolation cell, she kept her head held high, jaw clenched, trying to act unaffected. But inside, something had shifted. Not fear, she rarely showed fear. It was resentment, a deep, growing resentment toward everything around her. The staff, the inmates, the system. And resentment like that didn't fade in isolation. It hardened. It twisted. It waited as the cell door slammed shut behind her. One officer muttered under his breath that this wouldn't be the last time her name showed up in the incident log. And in a place where tension can turn deadly with a single spark, everyone knew he was right. She wasn't calming down. She was preparing for whatever came next. The days that followed felt like a slow-burning fuse. Every hour in segregation seemed to carve her deeper into herself, sharpening her resentment into something darker. Staff monitored her through the tiny window, waiting to see whether this incident had finally broken her or simply forced her further into the mindset that had brought her here in the first place. But she stayed still, too still. No shouting, no pacing, no attempts to negotiate for better conditions. Just silence, the kind that leaves officers wondering what's happening behind a face that refuses to show emotion at night. The unit halls carried echoes from other cells. Distant arguments, restless movement, someone crying on the far end. But she didn't join the noise. That was what unsettled people the most. Isolation affects inmates differently. Some unravel visibly, others implode quietly, but she did neither. Instead, she existed in a state of controlled tension, like someone carefully storing energy for the moment she could use it again. Officers passing her door said her eyes followed them in a way that made them instinctively glance back, checking that the locks were secure. Meanwhile, the administration reviewed her file again. Years of conflict, warnings, incidents, transfers, psychological evaluations, all pointing to a pattern that was only getting more unpredictable. The possibility of moving her to a more restrictive facility was no longer just a discussion. It was becoming the expected next step. And when a prisoner reaches that point, it isn't about punishment anymore, it's about containment. Protecting everyone around her from the storm she carried inside on the 8th day. They finally opened her cell door to move her for another evaluation. She stood up slowly, her movements rigid, her jaw tight. As they cuffed her, she didn't resist. But there was a tension in her posture that made every officer in that hallway stay unusually alert. Some inmates watched from their tiny windows as she walked past, escorted tightly by 2 guards on each side. No one taunted her. No one whispered. No one wanted to. Her presence had shifted from chaotic to dangerous, from loud to quietly volatile. And maybe that was the most chilling transformation of all. She wasn't the girl who lashed out impulsively anymore. She was someone who had learned how much damage she could cause, and how closely the system was now watching her as the heavy doors closed behind her and the echo faded into silence. One thing became clear. Her story inside these walls wasn't ending. It was evolving. And for everyone who had witnessed her spiral, the fear wasn't what she had already done, but what she might be capable of the next time the pressure inside her reached its breaking point.